Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start the webinar. Good afternoon. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar on consumer protection. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Megha Hamal, and I am the Communications Manager for the Illinois Power Agency, and I am responsible for hosting the webinar today. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. We have also enabled the live transcript button. If you wish to hide the live transcript button, simply click on the live transcript button, then hide subtitle. Please feel free to submit questions anytime during the webinar. We will be addressing those questions towards the end of the presentation. And please use the chat function on the bottom of the Zoom window to submit your question. Today's session is being recorded, and a recorded version of this session will be available on the IPA website under About Us, under Live About Us and Events. Attorneys that are registering this webinar for the CLE credits, we sent an email this morning with the course material. I hope you got them. If not, then we've also uploaded the course material on the IPA website. There we provided the link in the chat window to the course material. So please do access that. Couple of points I want to emphasize. The webinar is for general education, CLE purposes. Nothing that we are presenting is necessarily the position of the IPA or the Citizens Utility Board. Also, we will not be answering questions about the 2022 long-term plan or proposals the agency made in the draft as it is still under development. Lastly, we will be sending a survey after the webinar to gauge feedback from our participants, but most importantly, we are asking attorneys that are registering or attending this webinar for CLE credits to provide certain information to obtain the credit. So do fill out that survey. The survey is due on Friday, March 25th. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Our presenters for this session are Kelly Turner, Deputy Legal Counsel, Illinois Power Agency, Rachel Graneman, Consumer Protection Counsel, Illinois Power Agency, and Sarah Moskowitz, Deputy Director, Citizens Utility Board. Citizens Utility Board is a nonprofit, nonpartisan utility watchdog created by the Illinois General Assembly in 1984. As I mentioned earlier, after the presentation, we will be taking questions towards the end. So please do feel free to submit your question at any time during the webinar in the chat window. I would like now to give you an overview on the IPA Power Hour webinar series and its scope. So this is just a quick agenda. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about the Power Hour webinars, background on electricity markets and consumer protection. We'll be giving you an overview on consumer protection, current legislation and the IPA, and consumer protection requirements for the IPA administered incentive programs. So Power Hour is a series of educational and informative presentation on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. Today's Power Hour, we will discuss the history of customer choice and protection in the electricity sector of Illinois. We will review changes in the law governing Illinois solar programs and how and why the IPA monitors and enforces consumer protection standards. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is intended for general education and for CLE purposes only. We will not be answering questions about the draft long-term plan that is currently under development. Future IPA Power Hour webinars will cover topics related to clean energy economy in Illinois. So here is the upcoming Power Hour webinar that is taking place on April 29th, which is on net metering updates for distributed generation in Illinois. If you have not registered for the webinar, please do so. There is the registration link. You can also find this registration link under About Us events. A quick overview on the Illinois Power Agency. We are an independent state agency created in 2007. Our duties include development and implementation of procurement plans for the electricity supply for utility customers. We are also responsible for developing and implementing other renewable energy programs. We are also responsible for implementing the renewable portfolio standard. We do this through the development of long-term renewable resources procurement plan. We do this through by conducting competitive procurements for utility scale projects. And we manage programs, solar programs for community solar and solar for homes and businesses. So with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. Now I am pleased to introduce Sarah Moskowitz, Deputy Director at CUB, who will be providing a broader overview on Illinois' electricity markets and types of consumer protections issues at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Megha. And thank you to all my friends at the Illinois Power Agency for inviting me to speak today, and also for being such great allies when it comes to protecting consumer interests here in Illinois. Again, my name is Sarah Moskowitz, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Citizens Utility Board of Illinois, or CUB. And today I'm going to provide just some background, maybe a little color commentary on the electric market here in Illinois, how the proliferation of choices has affected consumers, and what kinds of issues we've seen and how we're trying to remedy them and prevent more of them going forward. So next slide, please. But first, just a little bit more about my organization. CUB was created, as Megha said, by state statute in the early 1980s, but we are a standalone nonprofit, nonpartisan organization representing the interests of residential and small business utility consumers across the state. We intervene in dockets at the Illinois Commerce Commission, work in Springfield for better legislation, and take our work to the courts when necessary. We also run a hotline and a robust grassroots outreach operation through which we help thousands of individuals each year resolve utility complaints, get connected to resources, and gain better understanding of these often complicated issues. This last portion of our work especially, I think, gives us a unique view into how state and federal energy policies affect everyday people. In turn, we can take what we see on the front lines and use it to inform, say, our next policy push or our next education endeavors. And real quick, what I say in this presentation represents what I've learned over my decades doing this work, but please don't take any of my perhaps offhand comments to represent an official stance of CUB, my employer. Next slide, please. So I myself tend to think in narratives and think that in order to understand the need for consumer protections in something like the state adjustable block program, it helps to understand the chain of events that got us here. So here's my beautiful timeline. For our purposes, I'd say the story starts in 1997 when the electricity market in Illinois was deregulated. This is when the electric distribution utilities were required to spin off their generating units and electricity supply rates were frozen for 10 years. Not coincidentally, 10 years later, a law was enacted taking energy procurement responsibilities away from the electric distribution utilities and giving those responsibilities to a newly formed state agency, the Illinois Power Agency, or IPA. This law also created our first statewide renewable and efficiency standards. Later, we saw further legislation doing grid modernization, smart meters, formula rates, etc. And then at the end of 2016, FEJA, or the Future Energy Jobs Act, passed. And this, with its creation of a state incentive program for solar, plus cool programs like Solar for All and Community Solar, which I believe my fellow presenters will discuss in more detail, really jump-started the residential solar market in our state. Meanwhile, however, deregulation of the energy markets, along with utility purchase of receivables policies, which I'll explain in a minute, had jump-started an alternative energy supply industry, which has caused big problems for gas and electric customers who have been misled into signing up for overpriced energy supply offers. So in 2020, a law called the HEAT Act was finally passed, putting some limits on what these companies can do, but a lot of damage has already been done, not just in terms of what the public has overpaid, which is over $1 billion at this point, but also in the atmosphere of consumer confusion and mistrust this market had fostered. Anyway, last September, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA, passed, and implementation of that sweeping law is now underway. And if things go at all well, it should move Illinois farther along the road to a clean energy economy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to recap a point I just made, here in Illinois, we are a deregulated state where the investor-owned electric utilities like ComEd and Ameren cannot own generation. You contrast this to your vertically integrated states where one company owns it all. One feature of a deregulated state is the presence of alternative retail electric suppliers, which we in the industry shorten to ARIES. The analog for natural gas is called ARGs. And these guys solicit folks to switch to them for the supply portion of consumers' electric bills. And in Illinois, we also allow municipalities to aggregate their residents, as long as the residents allow it by referendum, into a buying group that the utility can then, the municipality can then strike a deal on their behalf with the electricity supplier of their choice. Next slide, please. So residential enrollment in alternative retail electric suppliers peaked almost 10 years ago when we had some 3 million residential customers signed up, many of them through municipal aggregation. The industry really took off when purchase of receivables policies were adopted. That's where the utilities take over the billing and collections for a supplier. Surprise, surprise, suppliers don't want to have to deal with that. Since then, the investor-owned utility rates have become more competitive, and the HEAT Act has been at least somewhat effective in limiting the harm that some of the bad acting suppliers were doing. But I think I may have already said a lot of harm has already been done. Next slide. And here's just a summary of the protections the HEAT Act brought. Things like ending early termination fees, preventing suppliers from signing up recipients of low-income home energy assistance for plans that cost more than the going utility rate. So if a household receives LIHEAP, they can't be switched to a high-priced alternative energy supplier anymore. And requiring suppliers to include the utilities price to compare in their marketing materials and other things aimed at improving transparency. Next slide. Thank you. But again, a lot of harm has already been done. Despite the new consumer protections, people are still losing money with their choices in the energy market. Over $240 million were lost between June of 2020 and June of 2021, even after the HEAT Act passed. And here, I just want to make a point, just be clear about something. I think that customers should have choices. I remember back when there were no other rate options for electric customers, when there were no incentives for going solar, when there were, other than, offsetting your energy, your electric usage, when there were no efficiency programs for folks, people would come to us with high electric bills and there wasn't much to say to them other than use less. So it's great that there has been such a proliferation of other things that folks can do. But when all the choices are bad or are going to cause people to lose money, that's a problem. Or when consumers don't have the information they need to make good choices, that's a problem. Next slide, please. Well, I sure did just spend a lot of time now talking about alternative electricity suppliers. And so you might be wondering, what does this even have to do with the work that the IPA is doing? ARIES behavior doesn't even fall under the IPA's jurisdiction, but I actually think this is immensely relevant for a few reasons. First, to those of us in the industry, the differences between programs overseen by the IPA and those overseen by another agency like the Illinois Commerce Commission can be plain as day. We don't even need to discuss these differences because we're talking apples and bananas. But that is not so for the average consumer. The truth is, this situation with alternative suppliers has already muddied the waters immensely for the average consumer. Hopefully not past clarifying, but possibly. Issues with supply choice are bleeding over into everything else electric related, whether that's investor-owned utility offered real-time pricing options or things like the state's SREC incentives. The very first time I explained community solar to a consumer, FEJA had just passed and I was all excited about it. There weren't even any community solar projects live yet, far from it. I was telling this lady about it and she looked at me kind of perplexed and like maybe with like some pity. And she said, you maybe don't know this, Sarah, but we already have this. I actually signed up a couple of years ago with a company that's bringing me renewable energy already. And of course, she was talking about one of those alternative electric suppliers that markets themselves as green, saying that your energy will be coming from renewable sources if you switch to them. Now, we in the Illinois industry know that that's not exactly how it works. In fact, we have deep reservations about such offers and whether the extra cost they charge is at all warranted. But it's easy to see how a consumer would conflate the programs. And then consider the customer who's already been ripped off and knows it by an Aries. How likely are they then to participate in a legitimate program that actually will save them money and help spur renewable energy right here in our state? Is such a person ever going to believe such a program exists after what they've been through? Also, the Aries situation has taught us some things. It's taught us some ways to prevent or at least reduce poor outcomes for consumers. You can put rules in place preventing these companies from doing egregious things. You can put rules in place requiring these companies to disclose certain things to their customers or to their would-be customers. These are measures that the IPA is taking, and Kelly and Rachel are going to talk a lot more about that in a minute. At CUB, we've already fielded hundreds of solar-related inquiries and complaints from Illinoisans. Many of the more troubling complaints have to do with solar marketers overpromising, saying things like, hey, we're offering you free solar panels, or you'll never have to pay an electric bill again, or maybe just downplaying what the upfront cost for a person will be, or overstating what kinds of rebates a person can expect. For an investment like solar, the stakes for consumers can be really high. So again, I am immensely happy that our friends at the IPA are taking consumer protection seriously. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about what they're cooking. So thank you so much. I think my next slide is just like my contact info. So that's it for me.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. That is some great context, I think, for the next part of our presentation as we get into an overview on consumer protections in the context of the IPA state administered incentive programs. I'm going to kind of continue Sarah's narrative that she mentioned, that she likes to think of consumer protections in that way, and talk a little bit about the development of consumer protections for the IPA's programs, how we developed those consumer protections that are in place today, which Rachel will actually talk about those protections. And I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of statutory provisions surrounding the consumer protections under the IPA's program. If we can go to the next slide, please. So late in 2016, we saw the enactment of Public Act 990906, which was known as the Future Energy Jobs Act, or FEJA, what you see here. Among other items, FEJA made significant changes to the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard, the RPS, which is administered by the IPA. And under FEJA, the agency was charged with the development of our long-term renewable resources procurement plan, which is to be filed with and approved or approved with modification by the Illinois Commerce Commission every 2 years. In part, the long-term plan lays out the provisions of the Adjustable Block Program and the Illinois Solar for All program, which I have included the statutory references here for the parameters of both of those. These programs specifically are the programs under which we have developed consumer protections. These programs provide incentives for the development of new photovoltaic systems through the sales of renewable energy credits or RECs that are produced by the solar project. If you are unfamiliar with the concept of a REC, you can check out our last Power Hour webinar, which is posted on the IPA's website. But essentially, a REC represents the environmental attributes of the energy produced from a renewable energy resource, but it does not include or represent the energy itself. So the Adjustable Block Program, or you might hear me say ABP, features administratively set REC prices, which decline as blocks of capacity for the program are filled. While the Illinois Solar for All program is designed to incentivize the development of distributed generation and community solar in low-income communities or environmental justice communities throughout the state of Illinois. So the agency is charged with implementing and overseeing these state incentive programs. We are not charged with regulating the solar market or solar developers in Illinois. We do have discretion in interpreting the IPA Act and developing the program requirements for the ABP and Solar for All, subject to ICC approval of our long-term plan, which I'll get into in a few more slides. But we do not have plenary regulatory authority over these entities. So this is different from what Sarah was talking about earlier in terms of alternative energy suppliers and the authority that the ICC has over those entities. Next slide, please. So in developing the initial long-term plan and what the requirements for the ABP and Solar for All would look like, we noticed a few things. The agency recognized first and foremost that the purchase of a photovoltaic system is really a significant financial commitment for the system host, for the customer who's putting these panels on their roof or ground mounting them on their property somewhere. This is an especially acute consideration for residential customers, but also small business owners, other people who don't have familiarity with photovoltaics. We also recognize, which I think Sarah touched on a little bit, that community solar subscriptions can appear to customers to be similar to alternative energy supply offers, especially when they're viewed from a purely transactional standpoint. And as Sarah mentioned, some customers have been burned by bad alternative energy offers. There's some distrust in the marketplace and customer misunderstanding about what these offers actually are is a real concern. So when we look at all of these things together in context, we want to make sure that there is no negative impact on the development of our programs and generally on a robust solar market in Illinois. So the combination of all of these factors led us to the inclusion of consumer protections in our first long-term renewable resources plan, which was developed in 2017. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking in that context, those consumer protections, then there were a few different goals that we wanted to meet, hoping to better serve Illinois consumers and ensure that these state-administered incentive funding supports only entities that are responsibly serving the public. We don't want to be providing incentives to bad actors, those who are marketing fraudulently to customers. We want to protect the interests of consumers and businesses interested in solar power. That includes financial interests, but also really, educating these customers. We want to empower the customers to make informed decisions about going solar and give them confidence in this rapidly evolving solar market, making sure that there is no kind of misunderstanding resulting from experiences that they may have had with the alternative energy market, and use all of that to create a robust and viable solar market in Illinois, as well as successfully develop the Adjustable Block Program and the Illinois Solar for All program. Next slide, please. Okay, so I have some citations here to the IPA Act and the Commission's order approving the agency's long-term plan. Looking at this slide, when the initial long-term plan was submitted to the ICC for approval in 2017, and in approving that plan, the Commission recognized that the IPA has the authority to develop these consumer protection provisions, in part based on this language from the IPA Act that you see here. We had proposed in the initial plan that we would develop the protections with the program administrator, who at the time that the plan was approved had not yet been selected. And the Commission approved the agency's proposal to develop the requirements around consumer protections outside of the planning process, and to model those guidelines in part after the ICC's rules governing alternative energy suppliers under Part 412 of Title 83 of the Illinois Administrative Code. So in the long-term plan approval proceeding, the agency committed to the utilization of a stakeholder process to develop our marketing guidelines, minimum contracts, terms and conditions, standardized disclosure forms, and informational brochures for both the ABP and Illinois Solar for All program. A robust stakeholder process took place in 2018 involving workshops and written stakeholder feedback, all of which was utilized to develop the protections, which were finalized for the most part late in 2018. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the agency revises the long-term plan to take place every 2 years pursuant to the IPA Act and Section 16-111.5B of the Public Utilities Act. So in 2019, the agency submitted its revised plan to the ICC for approval. And I'm sorry, I neglected to mention on the next slide, Rachel's going to get into the actual specifics of our consumer protections that are in place when she does her presentation in a moment. But the long-term plan proceeding included a few key updates and items on consumer protection as well that came out of the approval of that revised plan. Perhaps the most significant of which is that the Commission affirmed the requirement that each individual customer must sign a standardized disclosure form. The Commission also affirmed the agency's ongoing ability to adjust our consumer protection guidelines outside of the plan proceeding as needed to respond to market changes. And of course, substantive changes to the marketing guidelines would be conducted through a stakeholder process, which we held in 2020. We also committed in that proceeding to updating the marketing guidelines to adapt relevant portions of the HEAT Act, which Sarah talked about a little bit earlier, developed community solar minimum contract terms, and I already mentioned the disclosure form requirements. On to the next slide, please. Now we're going to get into legislative changes surrounding consumer protections. Next slide. So changes in law under Public Act 102-0662. This was omnibus energy legislation signed into law on September 15th of 2021. Many of you have probably heard of it, known as the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA. Among its many provisions, many of which are not applicable to the IPA, but Public Act 1020662 revised and expands the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard under 175C of the IPA Act. And among these changes to the RPS were the explicit authority for the IPA to develop program terms, conditions, and requirements applicable to participating entities and project applications in coordination with its program administrators. Next slide, please. The next few slides here run through specifically what the changes under CEJA were that that are now being incorporated into the agency's plan, which is under development, which I mentioned we're not getting into, but I am going to run through the changes in law. We have here that the agency shall establish a registration process for entities seeking to qualify for the program administered incentive funding. Both programs have an approved vendor registration process, which Rachel will get into momentarily. This just codifies the responsibilities of the agency in listing out those entities on our website, the ability for vendors to receive program administered incentive funding. Next page. Under C1M2, sorry, there's a typo there. The agency shall establish program requirements, minimum contract terms to ensure program projects are properly installed and produce their expected amounts of energy. The agency can require repairs, alterations, other items that are necessary to remedy material deficiencies discovered. And vendors may lose their ability to receive incentive funding through agency programs and procurements if they have a disproportionately high number of deficient systems. Next slide, please. In order to discourage deceptive marketing practices, the agency may require program participants to provide standardized disclosure forms to customers prior to the execution of a contract for the development of a distributed generation system or a community solar subscription. Next slide. The agency is now charged with under 4 and 5 of C1M to, I think there's a typo on this as well, to utilize consumer complaint centers to address customer complaints under both programs, as well as file annual reports with the ICC in the proceeding for approval of its long-term plan to report on those complaints to the commission. Next slide. Finally, the agency is directed to coordinate with the Attorney General, the ICC, outside stakeholders, and law enforcement as necessary to share information about consumer protection issues, compliance with consumer protection provisions, and discuss complaints. And if there are complaints that implicate the jurisdiction of law enforcement, the Attorney General, or the ICC, the agency is directed to refer those complaints to those entities as appropriate. I believe that is my last slide, so I will turn it over to Rachel to talk about the requirements that the programs have in place. Rachel, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry. Thanks, Kelly. So I'm going to talk through the consumer protection requirements and materials that we currently have in place for both the adjustable block program and Solar for All. And this isn't every single requirement related to consumer protection, but it highlights the major pieces. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about is registration. So before a company is even eligible to participate in the program, they have to register. This lets us screen companies and potentially turn companies away if they have a history of bad behavior in other states. And it also ensures that we know who all is participating in the program. So since the beginning of the programs, approved vendors have had to register. The approved vendors are sort of the gatekeepers for the projects. They submit the applications to the programs, and they're the ones that receive the renewable energy credit incentive payment. So every project has to have an approved vendor to participate in the program. The requirement for designees to register is a little bit newer. So designees are any entity other than an approved vendor that participates in the program, and they perform work and services on behalf of an approved vendor. So they might do the marketing or enroll customers, design the actual solar project, or do installations. But ultimately, the approved vendors are responsible to ensuring that their designees, all these companies that they're working with, comply with the program requirements. So on the right here is a screenshot of the first section of the application for approved vendors. So anyone who wants to be an approved vendor in the program has to fill out a lengthy application with information about their organizational structure, financial information, whether they've had complaints or lawsuits or bankruptcies in the past, examples of the marketing materials that they're going to be using, and an attestation saying that they will agree to comply with all program requirements. So like I said, this registration ensures that we can both screen companies who participate and also know that we have information about who all is operating in the program. Next slide, please. So consumer education is a really important piece of consumer protection. We want to make sure that customers understand, at least in general terms, how the program works, and that they fully understand any offers that they're accepting and contracts that they're signing. This is an area that lots of customers are not familiar with. And as Sarah explained, this is an area where a lot of customers mistake community solar options with options that are offered by alternative retail electric suppliers. So it's really important that customers are educated. So the first thing we have here are informational brochures. We've got brochures for both the Adjustable Block program and the Solar for All program, and different brochures if you're installing solar on your property or if you're signing up for a community solar project. And these brochures have to be provided to the customer by the approved vendor or designee when they're soliciting a customer. The brochures explain how the program works. They talk through what sorts of considerations a customer should think about when deciding whether to take an offer, and also how to report complaints. Next slide. Disclosure forms. So this is something that Kelly mentioned. Disclosure forms are a really important tool for making sure that customers have clear and consistent information about offers. Companies are required to provide this filled out disclosure form to the customer, and the customer has to actually review and sign that disclosure form before they can sign the actual contract. So it's not a replacement for a contract, it's an additional document that highlights the key information that the customer needs to know. And it does this in a standard template so that a customer who wants to shop around can look at disclosure forms for various offers and can easily compare them because they're in the same format and the information is all presented in the same way. And then the approved vendor or designee has to upload the disclosure form once it's signed into the program portal so that we know that the customer has signed it. Next slide. So this piece is about the actual contract itself. The agency has created a set of required terms and information that every contract has to include. And it's a different list if you're looking at an adjustable block program project or a solar for all project, and depending on whether or not the customer is having solar installed on their property or whether they're signing up for community solar. But every contract for any of those is going to have to include information about pricing, including fees, about warranties and guarantees, about what happens at the end of the contract, or if you need to get out of the contract early, all of that sort of information. So this ensures that the contract the customers are signing include all the important information that needs to be there so that the customers knows what they're signing up for. Next slide. Additional consumer education. So we have additional ways of providing information to people. We have a couple different websites. So in addition to the Illinois Power Agency's own website, which provides some limited information, there are some program-specific websites that really get into the details. So we've got the Illinois Shines webpage, which is pictured here on the slide. This is the consumer-facing website for the Adjustable Block program. There's also a separate Adjustable Block program webpage that's focused more on the companies that are participating and has information that's geared towards what they're interested in. And then we have a website also for the Solar for All program. So these websites include general information on the programs, regular updates, information about how customers can go solar if they're interested in doing that. We've got a new project status tool that lets customers look up the status of the project and where it is in the program review process. We've got frequently asked questions, as well as contact information for the program administrators if people have questions or if they want to file a complaint. And then on the Solar for All side, which as Kelly mentioned is the low income program, there's a special program for grassroots education. So we have up to 1.5 million per year that can be given out in grants to organizations to conduct grassroots outreach campaigns. And this is really great because it lets trusted local groups help spread the word about going solar. And as both Kelly and Sarah mentioned, the issue of trust is really important so that the messengers who are explaining what solar is are people, are organizations that the people are talking to really trust. Next slide, please. Marketing guidelines and consumer protection guidelines. So turning back to the requirements for the actual companies themselves, we've got detailed consumer protection documents that lay out requirements for how companies can operate within the program. On the adjustable block program side, they're called the marketing guidelines and focus on mostly on marketing. And on the Solar for All side, they're called consumer protection guidelines because they're a little bit broader in scope. But in both programs, they lay out detailed information about when, where, and how companies can market to customers, what sorts of claims they can and can't make, and what sorts of things they can say about the program. They include requirements for giving the disclosure form and the informational brochures to customers, making sure that those disclosure forms are signed before the contract is signed. They include requirements for training salespeople, keeping records of those trainings. Some of the issues that that Sarah mentioned in terms of overpromising, those sorts of misleading statements are completely prohibitive, of course. Using logos from Cub or the utility or the IPA in a way that's misleading is totally prohibited as well. So this isn't everything that's in the guidelines. They're very detailed and lengthy, but it gives you sort of an idea of the breadth and scope of these requirements. And a lot of these requirements were initially modeled after the rules for the alternative electric and gas retail suppliers and then adjusted to fit our programs. And these marketing guidelines are updated periodically. They were updated especially to address the COVID pandemic at the beginning and then periodically through the pandemic to restrict how, whether and how companies could do in-person marketing. So at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, door-to-door marketing was prohibited entirely. And then there were mask requirements. And so that was all kept up to date to make sure that customers are kept safe. Next slide, please. So requirements specific to Solar for All. So we have some special additional requirements for the Solar for All program, which again is the low income program. And these are both procedural and substantive requirements. So low income communities have historically often been unable to participate in the clean energy economy, meaning there's already an information gap there where they might not understand how these sorts of programs work. And at the same time, they've often been targeted by predatory marketing, including from alternative retail electric suppliers, as well as low quality workmanship. So these additional requirements are intended to make sure the low income communities can participate in the program and that they can be adequately protected when they do so. So for example, in the Solar for All program, the customer cannot be required to pay any upfront fees and their total cost for the project or for their subscription can't be more than 50% of the value of the electricity generated by the solar project. So if a customer signs up for community solar and they're low income qualified, say they receive $20 of bill credits on their bill per month, their subscription price that they pay to the provider of that community solar project can't be more than half of that, so $10. And then these requirements are for specific saving levels, and additional requirements are supported by higher incentive payments for those renewable energy credits generated by the projects. Next slide, please. Consumer complaints. So tracking and responding to customer complaints is a really important part of consumer protection, of course. There are a number of ways that customers can report complaints online with a web form, via email, or via telephone. There's a public database of complaints that's published online, so that if you're interested in signing up for solar or having solar put on your property, you can go and look and see, what companies participate and whether or not they've ever had a warning or ever been suspended from the program or had other issues. In addition to the public database, the IPA also files an annual report on adjustable block program complaints and disciplinary actions with the Illinois Commerce Commission. And then when we get these complaints, what happens is the program administrator will investigate. We'll talk to the customer, talk to the company, figure out what happened, if there was a program violation, and if appropriate, can take disciplinary action. Next slide, please. So that brings me to my final slide on disciplinary action. In addition to tracking and investigating complaints from customers, the program administrator also monitors what's going on in the marketplace, including requesting marketing materials or training materials from companies, and keeps track of these practices on an ongoing basis. So the program administrator can take disciplinary action based on a complaint by a customer or something that they have themselves discovered that's happening in the market or in the program. So when disciplinary action is appropriate, it can take various forms, from a warning letter to probation to suspension. Suspension can be temporary or permanent, and would of course prevent the company from participating in the program. So one example of a program suspension was at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. Like I said, the IPA put a ban on door-to-door sales. A few companies continued to do door-to-door sales anyway, and the IPA suspended those companies temporarily from the program. So that's just a quick example of what disciplinary action can look like in practice. And I think that's it for my slides. So I think we'll move to questions.
Thank you, Rachel. I am looking at the chat window and I'm not seeing any question yet, but maybe we can give a minute or so to see if anyone has any question. I see a question from Rosemary. This is a question for Rachel. Do community solar informational brochures need to be delivered upon any solicitation act, regardless of whether or not a potential subscriber attempts to enroll, or do they solely need to be provided the informational brochure at some point before enrollment or before enrolling?
Yeah, I would have to go back to the marketing guidelines to double check. And Kelly, you might know this offhand. I believe they're supposed to be provided at the initial point of contact when an initial marketing or solicitation occurs. And then they're actually attached as well to the disclosure form, which was an update that was made recently. So so in addition to the requirement of being provided upfront, it will then also be attached as the first 2 pages preceding the disclosure form, just to make doubly sure that the customers are actually getting that.
Thank you, Rachel. Any other question for any of our speakers, Kelly and Sarah? Okay, so here is another question from Chuck. Is the IPA planning to publish the compliance statistics of approved vendors, DG and community solar, similar to what the ICC does for ARES providers on the ICC's website?
I can take this one. The IPA has a website on, well, I should say the program administrators do. Each program website has a complaint report on it that includes complaint information, and that is already online. And I think I can try to stick the links to those in the chat.
Great, and I think there is a follow-up to that question. The gentleman is asking, and when?
So that is ongoing, and it's on the websites for the programs, the IllinoisABP.com and IllinoisSFA.com are the websites. but I'll try to drop in a link directly to those consumer protection websites.
Thank you, Kelly. See, we still have a few more minutes. Maybe we can, give a minute to see if we get more questions. Oh yeah, Kelly just dropped the link. Thanks, Kelly. Well, so I'm not seeing any new questions at this point. So if there are no new question, well, one just came up from Chuck, and this says, will the current IPA disclosure form be updated soon for the new CJA tariffs for Comet and Amarin?
So in terms of updates to the disclosure forms, I think that this kind of touches on what the agency is going to be doing forward under our new long-term plan, which is going to be filed with the ICC on Monday. So look to that for any updates about disclosure forms or disclosure form requirements that we are going to be proposing within that. But in terms of the CJA tariffs for Comet and Amarin, I'm not sure if you're actually getting to the fact that net metering is changing, or that different tariffs will feed into the what's commonly referred to as the full retail rate net metering. I think kind of all of that will be rolled up into the price to compare, which is what the net metering rate is going to be set at now under CJA.
Thanks, Kelly. So I think we're getting close to our end of the presentation, and we're almost getting closer to 1-2. So on behalf of the IPA, maybe can we take one more question? For prospective customers, what are some key aspects that they should consider before choosing a vendor? Maybe choosing an approved vendor. I think that's the question.
Yeah, I think Sarah or Rachel, feel free to chime in on this. I would say for customers who are looking to participate in the program, in either program, there are a list of vendors and designees on the websites, and prospective customers should do their research. I think Rachel touched on, getting multiple kind of offers before enrolling or before signing a contract are good goals and things to look for, to compare what different offers are out there in the marketplace. And then, ensuring that the vendor that you're working with is approved in the program. If you are looking to make sure that your system will be eligible to apply for incentives under the program. I think that those are all very important factors. And I don't know, Sarah or Rachel, if you have anything else that you want to add to that.
I think you covered the main stuff, making sure it's an approved vendor with the program, and making sure you understand what the offer is, what your requirements will be, what the benefits are. Getting offers from a couple different vendors is not a bad idea at all. Ask for those disclosure forms and compare them and see what your best option is.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to point out also that in addition to getting multiple quotes, which CUB definitely recommends quotes from 2, preferably 3 different vendors would be ideal. We also have resources on the CUB website to help people go through some checklists about things to watch out for, and ask questions, ask around, not just of the vendor that you're talking to, but if you still need further clarification, CUB is a resource. We're very proud about the fact that we answer our phone. So when in doubt, you can also give us a call, because we'll do what we can to steer you the right direction, but also you're going to be providing really valuable information for us as a watchdog.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Sarah. So on behalf of the IPA, I want to thank everyone for joining this webinar on consumer protection. We hope it was educational and informative. I also want to thank our wonderful presenters for sharing such insightful information on what consumer protection looks like for the solar market in Illinois. The IPA will be sending out a survey soon, hopefully today. So please be on the lookout for that survey. Those that attended the webinar for the CLE credits, we're asking to fill out certain information to make sure you get the credits. So please do so by March 25th. And with that, I want to thank again everyone, and we will see you on the next Power Hour. Thank you.